I'm at the cabin this week and we are getting so close to having this thing wrapped up. One of the last things I need to do, well, there's a lot, but one of the big ones is to get the entire cabin trimmed out. Now I know a video on trimming out a house could be kind of boring, but this is something a lot of you guys are probably gonna do at some point in your life, is add trim someplace in your house. So I'm gonna try and stop throughout this video and give you some of my favorite helpful tips for how to trim out a house, how to do it properly, and how to make it look the best you could possibly make it look. So I got this entire house to trim out in just 1 week to do it. We gotta get to work. Let's go. If you've been following along with the cabin updates, you know that I built this temporary staircase to fool the inspectors because, well, it's got to be up to code, and the real one we want to build, it's going to be a little different. It's going to look nicer. It's going to fit the space better. It's just not quite up to code. Good news is we passed final inspection 2 days ago, so now I can rip out this temporary staircase. Now, when it comes to trimming, I'm gonna be doing kind of a decorative plate rail around the entire downstairs, and the stairs are kind of gonna be in the way for the painters. So I'm gonna start trimming upstairs because that's just gonna be regular baseboard everywhere, get the whole upstairs trimmed out. Then I can rip down these stairs and trim out the downstairs. And then the painters can just go up and down on a ladder, and then after everything's painted, I'll come in and build the new set of stairs. So we're gonna start upstairs.
I just couldn't help myself. The railing was in the way, so before I went upstairs, I kind of tore that down because I just like tearing stuff down.
Now, I think one of the biggest first-timer mistakes when it comes to doing trim in a house is people just don't think through picking out the right trim for the right situation. Lots of times people pick out a nice baseboard trim and they think, I'm just gonna use this for the floorboard and I'm also gonna use it to trim around the doors. But I think that's a mistake, and let me tell you why. Come in here a little bit closer. Now, this is the trim that we're gonna be using for our baseboard. It's about 3/4 of an inch thick, and this is just a little offcut, but it's gonna go around the entire floorboard like that. Now, the problem is, if you use this same trim for the door, that's also 3/4 of an inch, this stuff comes stock with just a little bit of a round over. So when you bring that trim into the door, and now this piece is oriented like this, you're gonna have a freshly cut piece up against this piece, and that round over is gonna create a nice little gap. Not to mention, it's really hard to get those perfectly on the same plane, so it's just not gonna look great. So when you're picking out your trim, what I like to do is get a thicker piece of trim that I wrap all my doors with. Now this is about 1 inch thick, so this will go around the entire perimeter of the door like that. And then when we bring our floorboard up to it, now we got a nice little step off from our baseboard to our door trim. So there's about 1/4 of an inch right there that the door trim will be proud. This gives us a great surface to bring that base trim to the edge of. You can get a little bit of caulking in there, paint it. Even if you're using finished grade wood, this is gonna look so much nicer than using the same thickness trim for your baseboard and your doors. Another thing is order of operations. I've seen a lot of people, when they start trimming out a house, they just go right to the baseboard. The problem is the baseboard needs something to run into around the doors. Now your door trim is gonna go all the way down and make contact with the floor. So you actually wanna do all of your doors first, get those trimmed out, and then once those are trimmed out, you've got a nice ending point for all of your base trim to run into. So that's what we're gonna get started with. I'm gonna trim out these 2 doors, and once we get those done, then we'll move on to our baseboard. We're just gonna assume that your door jambs were installed correctly. If they were installed correctly, the edge of the jamb should be perfectly flush with your drywall, which means that when you take a piece of trim, it can sit on the jamb and make contact with the drywall, and it's not gonna be at a severe angle. Now, I get questions a lot about how far back or where should you place this door trim. Should I push it right flush with the door jamb? I don't think that's a great idea because it's gonna be really hard to get a consistently, perfectly flush trim all the way around. And as we know, if you're using a wood, not a composite trim, it expands widthwise or shrinks widthwise. So over the seasonal movement, if it expands, it's gonna lip over the edge of your door jamb, and that's not going to look good. So you do want to set it back. Now the question is, how much do you set it back? It really doesn't matter. The thing that matters is that you're consistent on the sides and the top. You don't want it set back a 1/2 inch here, a 1/4 inch on the other side, an 1/8 inch on the top. So however much you set it back, let's say a 1/4 inch, you just want to match that around all sides of your doors and then try and match that throughout your house so everything is consistent.
Now, you can do this a lot of different ways. You can use a tape measure and just measure over. I like to grab a setup block for the reveal that I want. I think this was just a 1/4 inch setup block, so I set it on the side. I draw a line like this, and then I also set it up on the top, and I draw a little line, and then that little corner where those two lines come together, that's where I take my measurements for my door trim, and this should ensure that everything is nice and even all the way around the door frame. Then all you gotta do is take your measurements for your 3 door frame pieces, do the same thing to the other side, and you are good to go. And by go, I mean start making cuts.
One of the reasons I really like these fast cap tape measures is they got this big white thing here. So when you're doing trim, it's really easy to just jot down your measurements that you need, run down to the saw, and then when you're done, you can just erase them off and then move on to the next door and take your measurements. It just helps you remember if you got to do multiple cuts at the same time. Look at all of this trim right in the middle of my garage, which is not ideal because I need a workspace, but luckily I made one right over there. Another thing I would highly recommend when you're doing trim work is take the time to get a good setup for your miter saw. You're gonna be using it a lot. It doesn't have to be a Capex with the extension wings. Whatever it is, get some sawhorses, get some pieces of plywood so you have really nice long extensions, because you don't want to trim out an entire house with boards flopping off the end of your piece. It's just going to drive you crazy. So take the extra 10 minutes to get a good setup before you get going. I'm going to do mitered door wraps. So basically it's going to be a 45 at the top of the door. I just think it looks really nice and clean. It's not too ornate. You can do it a bunch of different ways. You could do something fancier with a square top, and then you could overhang the top, obviously not with a big miter on it. You can get more decorative top door packages, but I'm not doing that. I'm just gonna do classic miters. Now the thing you gotta remember if you're mitering is that you gotta switch the direction of your miter cut for both sides of the door. Because if you're using pre-primed trim, it's only primed on one side, so you can't flip that around. So you gotta cut one miter this way, and then you gotta cut the other miter that way. You will mess it up. You'll cut both miters on the same side and you'll be frustrated, but just trying to remember, switch it for your long pieces.
Now, I had the lamello laying around, and I thought to myself, why don't I add some little lamello clips to all these miters to clip them together, and that'll make life easier. So I did. And I know that might be overkill, but just deal with it, all right? Sometimes as woodworkers, we do things that, just, they're a little bit above and beyond. And those are the things we take pleasure in.
Now, I'm fully aware that a lot of comments are gonna come in that, oh, it's so unnecessary to put anything in those miters, just stick them up there, tack them on with a little glue. You can totally do that. If you hire somebody to do your house with trim, they're probably gonna just fly through and do the exact same thing. What you will notice with mitered corners like this, it is the #1 thing that in a year, 2 years, you're gonna see open up. And there's gonna be a crack there, and you're gonna have to go and re-caulk it and repaint it. It just doesn't wanna stay together. So at the very least, definitely put some glue in there. Biscuits aren't a bad idea. Trying to tack it together is not a bad idea. But if you can get an internal clamp in there that holds it together, why wouldn't you? I have the lamello, so I'm gonna do it that way. The other nice thing is that we have essentially 4 of these surrounds that we have to do upstairs. All the doors are pretty much the same size. So now that I have this one together, I can move it to the other doors and test it and see if they're all the same and they're gonna fit. And if they are, I can just run down and make them real quick, and I don't have to go door by door, which is pretty handy.
So I tested this frame on the other doors, and lucky for me, it fit beautifully on all 4 doors. So then it was time to glue everything up.
All right, now that we have all of our door trim pieces cut for upstairs, and I know that they fit, we can start permanently hooking them together. Now, you definitely want to glue these seams, like I said. I like to use a combination of CA glue and wood glue. The CA glue basically acts as an instant clamp, makes sure that it holds together firm, and then the wood glue will be a stronger hold that will take a little bit longer to dry. The CA glue just makes it so we don't have to wait around for the wood glue to dry. And the nice thing with these lamello clips is that also acts as a clamp to really suck everything together. So, put a little wood glue on our first seam here. And then also going to put some CA glue, which is essentially super glue. Just got to be careful not to drip it all over your brand new hardwood floor.
So I added some CA glue, some regular glue, and I clipped everything together. I held it in place until that CA glue dried up nice and well, and then I was ready to install my door surround.
Now, before we just start nailing our trim up here, you want to take a minute and kind of look at where the studs are. Most doors are shimmed in to make them fit right. You can see this one's shimmed way over to the right. So it's pretty much tight against the stud over here. So we know we have a stud right there. But you got this gap that's almost an inch right here. So when we put our trim up, if we're sending nails into that gap, obviously it's not gonna bite into anything. And we wanna make sure that our nails are going into studs. Same with drywall. Lots of people think, oh, you just nailed into the drywall. The trim is going to eventually wanna loosen up from that drywall, and that's where your caulking seam along the top is gonna open up and it's not gonna look good. So make sure you find the studs and that you're nailing into the studs.
It was really weird. I took a stud finder out and I held it up against my chest and it just started beeping like crazy. That was a dad joke.
Now that our doors are all trimmed out, we can start laying our baseboard. Now, when it comes to baseboard, what I like to do is I like to do the longest walls first. The reason is that we don't want to waste trim, and chances are we're going to have smaller cutoffs once we do the longer pieces. So we do the longer walls first because we're getting the most material out of that. And then when we get to the little corners and the little wraparounds, we can use our cutoffs from the long pieces to do those short runs. If we start with the short pieces and we do all those first, well, then we're gonna end up with these awkward lengths that might not be long enough to do our long walls. So this is the longest wall in the room. I'm gonna measure for this one and go down and cut some pieces. Now, if it wasn't such a small area upstairs, if there was a ton of trim, I'd bring my saw up here because I don't want to be going downstairs and back up and downstairs and back up. But it's a pretty small room up here, so I'm just gonna get my steps in today, go downstairs. But when I get to trimming out the entire downstairs, I'm gonna make sure my saw is close by so I'm not wasting a bunch of time running back and forth.
So I took the tight measurements for my longest wall, and when I say tight measurements, I mean I always round up to like a 1/16 of an inch higher than I think I need just in case.
Now the length of this wall was 17 feet. Unfortunately, I only have 16-foot runs of base trim, so I had to put a seam along this wall. Now 16 feet's only a foot away from 17 feet, so a lot of people would just put a seam a foot off of that far wall. I think that looks pretty terrible because you wind up with this little chunk, and if you see that seam, which hopefully you won't, it just looks like you added a little filler piece. It doesn't look that professional. So if you have to put a seam along a long wall, give yourself a nice big chunk of trim and do it somewhere in the middle. My seam is right here. I know it's hard to see on camera, but if you come in close, I'll show you how I did it. If you want your seam to look terrible, just do a butt joint, 2 pieces of trim right against each other, and you're always gonna see a huge seam and probably a gap eventually. If you want it to pretty much disappear, cut your 2 pieces at a 45 and stitch them together that way. The reason is that if this one overlaps a little too much, it's fine. We can sand all that down and there's wood behind it that's gonna fill in as we sand. So I have this piece here. It's got a 45 against that corner and then a 45 cut there. You always want to install this piece first with the point against the wall, not this piece. That way we can adjust the distance on this piece. Now I also want to cut this piece a little too tight so that it overlaps just a hair. That way we can come back and we can sand it flush and make sure that that seam is perfect. If you get it perfect on the first try, it's okay, but if that board moves at all, it's gonna be below this piece and it's just not gonna look as good. So I like to have it just a little bit proud and then come back and sand it all flush. We're also gonna glue this seam when we hook it together and nail it in place, just to help prevent it from sliding around over time.
Just like installing trim around the door, you want to find the studs when you're installing base trim. Don't just go around willy-nilly throwing nails any old place. Make sure the nails are going into studs so the trim holds tight.
I also made sure to land my seam really close to a stud on this side of the overlap so that I can push this whole piece right into that and get really good grip.
With my first and longest piece of trim installed, I got to work on all the other walls. Thankfully, they were all under 16 feet, so I could use full runs on every other wall in the room, starting with my biggest walls and working my way down in size to get to the smaller ones. You might find places where your walls are a little wonky and there's a little bit of a gap at the top of your trim. That's okay, that's what caulking's for. But as you can see, that 3/4 inch trim butts really nice into that 1-inch door surround. When I get to mitered corners on the outside of a corner like this, I like to glue and clamp them up before I install them. I let the glue completely dry, ensuring that corner is nice and secure, and then I nail it to the wall. I like to use these little spring clamps. You can get them on Amazon for super cheap. I'll include a link in the video description. They come with this little pair of pliers to open them up, and they just pinch onto the corner and they leave hardly any marks at all. So you don't have to go back and fill a bunch of stuff with wood filler after the fact. But make sure you wait until your glue is good and dry. Don't nail it to your wall too soon or you're just gonna break that miter apart and all that work is gonna be for nothing. I actually left this corner for a couple hours, went out and worked on trim in the other room, and then came back and removed the clamps. As you can see, that miter is super tight, looks great, and now we can nail it to the wall and we don't have to fear it opening back up. So you just slide it into place, find a few studs, which we know are right on this corner, and tack it securely.
Well, hey there. I want to give a huge thanks to our sponsor of this video, AG1. Now, I know you've heard me talk about AG1 before. I love it. It's something I've added to my daily routine. I really think it's beneficial, and let me tell you why.
You see, AG1 is so much more than greens. It's your daily drinkable scoop of vitamins, minerals, probiotics, and whole food sourced ingredients in one. Validated by research and formulated for you. AG1 helps your whole body, brain, and gut health just thrive. I travel a lot and it's always hard to get the right things into my diet, so I love that AG1 aids in gut health and energy, healthy mood, immune support, all that stuff, and it's so easy and convenient to take. Now I know you're familiar with AG1, but I have something new to share. Do you realize that most people aren't getting enough omega-3s? Which is a shame because omega-3s are crucial for brain and heart health. That's why I'm stoked about this new AG Omega-3. It's a foundational nutrition soft gel supplement that complements AG1 with high-quality formulation of omega-3 fish oil, making it easy to get the additional essential fatty acids you need each day. AG Omega-3 fish oil soft gels are separate from AG1 to ensure you're getting the highest quality and most highly absorbable forms of omega-3s. That's why I just usually take them with my AG1 every morning.
Subscribe today to get a 1-month supply of AG Omega-3 with your first order of AG1. You'll also get their welcome kit with everything you need to get you started on your AG1 journey. Just go to drinkag1.com/bourbonmoth or scan the QR code right here. Huge thanks to AG1 for sponsoring this video. What's up? I was up late last night. I got all of my nail holes filled. I ran a bead of caulking around everything that needed caulking, and so now I just got to do a little finish sanding on these baseboards and the upstairs is done. For wood filler, I really like this farm wood filler for filling nail holes. I won't say it doesn't shrink at all, but it shrinks the least amount out of the wood fillers that I have found that are still easy to spread. Lots of people like to put the wood filler in with a putty knife. I don't really love that because you get the wood filler so perfectly flush with the outside of the trim that when inevitably it does shrink, then you can see where you filled your hole. So I just like to use my finger, and what I do is I fill the hole and I pile it up a little bit proud so that as it shrinks, then when you sand it off, it's perfectly flush. So now that I filled all the nail holes, I'm gonna go knock these down real quick with the sander, and then yeah, the upstairs is good to go. When it comes to caulking your baseboards, only run a bead of caulk around the top and in your seams. I have seen before where people try and caulk the seam where the baseboard hits the floor. Don't do this. You might be tempted because you're like, oh, but there's a gap down there. It will move, it will pull apart, it will look terrible. It's not supposed to be caulked. Leave that seam as it is. All right? Okay. And then we gotta go do the whole downstairs because there's a whole different type of trim down there. Ugh. I always make sure to hit these corners really well because there's always a little bit of a lip and you want to make sure they're smooth. If you're using pre-primed trim and you go through the primer, it's okay. You just don't want to concentrate so hard in here. You kind of want to feather it out as you're sanding so that you don't see that after you get your other paint and primer on there. One more word about caulking. Lots of people are like, I caulk seams and then they always crack. What can I do to make sure that they don't crack and pull apart? The fact of the matter is, if the seam is too big and you fill it with caulk, it is going to crack, it is going to pull apart. So what you're gonna have to do is, you're just gonna have to caulk it twice. You get that caulking in there and it shrinks. It will always shrink. If the gap's small enough, it's usually not that big a deal. But with a bigger gap, when it shrinks and completely dries, you need to go back over it a second time, fill it in again, and then the second time you should be good. So just quit being lazy and do it twice.
It took me about a full day to do all the trim upstairs, including the door surrounds in the bathroom, filling nail holes, caulking, sanding, but it looked pretty darn good. I was confident it was ready for paint and it was time to move downstairs, which meant that I could now remove the fake stairs that we built to fool the stinking inspectors. I have no ill will against the inspectors, they're just doing their job. But still, we did have to build a fake set of stairs to fool you, which we did. So I pulled down the temporary stairs, I threw them on the front porch, and now it was time to get to work doing all the trim downstairs. Since the downstairs was much bigger and I didn't want to keep walking to the garage, I decided to move my saw inside and get a real nice setup.
The upstairs was the easy part because it was just base trim. Downstairs we're doing something a little more complicated. We are going to do this beadboard as a decorative plate rail. And the only difference between a plate rail and a chair rail is that a plate rail is a little bit taller. So the beadboard is going to go on the wall. There's still going to be base trim and then there's going to be a cap. Now, you could put your base trim down just like we did upstairs and then set the beadboard right on top of it. The reason I don't like to do it that way is that if your floor is not perfectly level and that base trim slopes or has any bows to it, then when you go to set your beadboard on top, there's gonna be gaps because this is gonna be perfectly straight. So what I like to do is take my base trim and I like to rabbet out a little 1/2 inch groove on the back that is the same depth as the beadboard. So that way I can set my base trim down and then I can tuck the beadboard in behind it. That way, if it's not perfectly level, that little 1/2 inch rabbet is gonna hide any of that unevenness. It's just gonna look a lot cleaner and nicer. And then to cap it all off, I just have a smaller piece of trim. I do that same rabbet on the top, and then we can lock it in place. I can also make sure that this one is perfectly level, and if I have to tweak it slightly because the beadboard's not perfectly straight, it's okay because I have that rabbet on there. So, I need to go rabbet out a bunch of base trim and top trim first, and then we're essentially gonna do exactly what we did upstairs. Do all of our baseboard with that rabbet side up. Once we have that all laid, we can come back and start putting our beadboard in.
So into the garage I went with a bits and bits rabbiting bit set at 1/2 inch and the depth of that beadboard, and boy, I just made a crazy amount of dust. Then it was back into the house to take my freshly rabbited trim and do the baseboard all over the place. When I got to these outside corners, another thing I like to do is just take a screwdriver and run it along those outside corners just to soften them a little bit so they're not so pokey.
When you have long runs that you have to do that dead end into a corner, it can be really hard to get that corner seam perfect. So what I like to do is I like to just have a scrap piece of wood that I use to get my angle, because that way I can cut it at a 45, but you're gonna find out that no walls are ever exactly 45. And you shove it in there, and then you can see if you have to change the angle of it, if you have to change the degree of the corner there from 45 to 47 or 44. You can really play around with it until you get that nice and tight. Then you can cut your long run, make sure that that end is exactly how you test fit it, cut the other end at a 45, and then you'll test fit your next piece off of that 45. It's really easy to have one piece at a 45 and then adjust the other piece to get a nice tight fit. It's really hard to get both ends exactly right. So just kind of work your way around the room with a test piece like this, and it'll make sure that those corners are perfect. I was really hoping they'd make a there sound. Perfect, like that.
With all of my base trim done, it was time to start laying out our beadboard. Now the beadboard comes in 4-foot sections, so this is gonna take a while.
Okay, I've got all of my base trim in so we can start putting up our beadboard. Now there's a couple different ways that you can do this. You can try and land it so that your seams are right on studs and then nail into the studs, find all your studs, tack it on there. That's okay, it's just a lot of work, and then you gotta go back and fill all those nail holes. The preferred method, the way I like to do it, is liquid nails. You just squirt some, especially around the perimeter, a few dabs in the center, and yes, stick it to the wall. Yes, this is gonna be a bigger pain if you ever want to remove it, because it's gonna rip some of that drywall off, but you don't have to worry about the studs. You can just stick it up, and I think it's easier to get your seams nice and even. So that's what I'm gonna do. As you're putting up the beadboard, you kind of want to think about the wall that you're doing and lay it out before you put it up so that you don't get to an outlet and have it on a weird seam. You want to make sure that you're not going to wind up with just a really thin little tiny piece of your pattern against a wall. It's basically like laying out tile. You just want to think about it before you put it up so you don't get anything weird, and then you're like, oh shoot, I already glued it to the wall. So I've kind of already done that on this wall. We're just going to work our way around, measuring and cutting out for all the outlets and windows. It's going to be a lot of work, but hopefully it'll look cool. Just give everything a nice press. Liquid nails has good holding power once you kind of push it together. So once it's stuck, unless you're really rip, it's not gonna come off. Now, I mean, obviously if you pull on it, it will come off until it dries, but should be good.
Unfortunately for me, the walls in this very old cabin were so wonky that there were a few places that I had to tack in some nails because the liquid nails just needed a little help. When I got to the outlets, I very carefully measured and I cut all the holes out with a multi-tool. I found that the track saw just laid down on the ground on a couple of 2x scraps worked really well to cut all my panels to the right size, and I could cut the ends at a slight angle if I needed to get really tight against a wonky wall. So I just set to work, cutting panels, adding some liquid nails, slapping them up there, making sure my seams were nice and tight, and working my way around the entire house. When I got to corners like this, I really wasn't too careful about making them look very pretty because I'm going to be putting some corner trim over all the corners, something that looks like this. It's just a 1/4 inch thick. It will sit not quite over the top of my base trim, so there'll be a nice step back there, and once it's all painted up, it'll look very nice and professional. So whatever you do on the corners, just make sure that corner trim covers it up. For the windows, I would just take a full piece, stick it up over the window, and then reach behind there and trace out the shape of the window. Then I'd go over to the track saw, cut out that shape, zip zap zoop, and then hopefully it would fit very nicely around the window. I'm also going to add a window sill and frame it out a little bit more, but I'll show you that a little bit later. Pretty soon I had all the beadboard up in the main room, and I had moved on to the other parts of the house.
This electrical panel is in the most unfortunate spot because the plate rail is going to go right there. And it's kind of in a prominent spot. I wish we could have moved it, but it is what it is. So I've been scratching my head trying to figure out what is the best way to do this so it doesn't look ridiculous. Now, obviously the best thing to do is just to cover it up, but we need access to the panel. My wife, however, found a nice painting that she wants to hang here that will cover it up, and then we can just take the painting off the wall if we need access to the panel. The problem is, for the painting to cover the whole panel, it's got to sit over the chair rail and it wouldn't sit even on the wall. So what I'm going to do is I created this frame. I'm going to mount this to the wall. It is just larger than the painting is going to be, so the painting can hang on this frame. It'll have a nice reveal around the entire outside. I can run the chair rail around this, make it look all nice, hang the painting over here, and then if we ever need access to the panel, we can just take the painting off. The painting we picked out is a pretty standard size, so if we ever want to switch out the art, it should be pretty easy to find another picture painting that's that size, and there'll just always be a piece of art here, or a mirror, or something. It's the best I could come up with. So that's what I'm gonna do.
I know this might be a little funky, but sometimes you just gotta do things to make it look good. Or more importantly, make your wife happy. So that's what I'm gonna do. After I made my frame, I added a rabbet to the outside edge on that lower portion. So the frame could actually sit over the top of the beadboard and give me a really nice reveal all the way around. I stuck it up there, made sure it was level and centered in that wall, found a few studs, and I tacked it in place. I don't know. I think it'll look okay. Oh yeah, here's me adding some sills and kind of framing out these windows a little bit better. Basically, I just made a 3/4 inch sill for the bottom, or a base plate, with some returns on the side that stuck out past the edge of the window. Then I added a little filler piece on the bottom to make it look a little more ornate. I cut some thin strips of beadboard, I stuck it on the top to match the height of everything else, and then I started slapping on those top rail pieces. Then I come back in afterwards and I add some more of that corner trim, and all in all, it looks pretty darn good. It took me like 5 or 6 days straight to get all the beadboard up with the base trim and the beadboard and the top rail and trim around the windows and the outlets. Now, the top rail just inside of our front door, I thought it would be a really cool place to add some integrated coat racks, or little pegs that stuck out of that top rail. Luckily, I had this portable drill guide from Rockler, so I set up a little jig to hold it at the right height. I marked where I wanted all my pegs to be, and I went along and drilled a bunch of holes. Then I cut down a bunch of wood pegs to the same size and then used my little trim router, kind of like a tiny little router table, to round over the top edge of all of my pegs. I added a little fixo to all the holes so that I could permanently affix the pegs in the holes. And then I added a little piece of tape onto this square so that I could set all the pegs at the same distance out from the wall. So I just went down the line and hammered them in like one of those little games you play when you're a kid in the doctor's office. And I thought it looked pretty cool, and once it's all painted up, I think it'll look sweet.
I'm just about to start trimming out the bathroom. This is just getting baseboard. In the rest of the house, I've been using MDF trim because it's being painted, it's way cheaper, there's a lot of trim to do. But in the bathroom, I do not recommend using MDF. If it gets wet, it will expand and disintegrate. It's not great if it's gonna come in contact with water. So for all the bathrooms, laundry rooms, I'm switching to finger jointed pine. It does a lot better in damp areas. So it's okay to use MDF. It's a great product for trimming out a house if you're gonna paint. Just know where to use it and where not to use it. Don't use it in the bathroom, or the hot tub, or the swimming pool.
The last thing on my list to do before painting all the trim was this cabinet unit in the master bedroom. Now, this was original to the house, and we actually liked the cabinet in there because it gave a lot of storage. I just didn't like the way it looked or the way it was laid out. It had cabinet doors on the bottom and the top, and we wanted to add drawers to the bottom and then keep the cabinet doors on the top. Now, rather than ripping the whole thing out and rebuilding it, I thought the carcass was actually in decent shape. So my solution was just to build a brand new face frame and stick it right over the top of the old unit. Then we could paint the entire thing and nobody would ever know that that original unit looked completely different. So I took all my measurements, I ripped down some poplar, and then just on the floor in the master bedroom, I started putting together a giant face frame. But this time it had drawers on the bottom and cabinet doors on the top. Once I had the entire face frame put together, I very carefully wiggled it inside the master bathroom and I pushed it into place. Now, because I took all the measurements directly off the wall and kind of pieced it together before I actually hooked it together, I knew it was going to be a pretty darn perfect fit, which it was. Now you can see I didn't make the face frame tight against the ceiling because I needed to be able to lift it up into place inside the room. So after I got it in there and I liked the way it looked, which I gotta say, it looks pretty good. Then I just cut a little trim piece of poplar. I added it to the top to cover up that seam. I tacked the face frame onto the old cabinet and boom, I was done.
Whew. That was a doozy, but I managed to do it. The entire house is trimmed and now it is time to paint. So I wanted to give you a few tips on how I do my painting. I like to use Peter paint. By that I mean, I hire a guy named Peter and, well, he paints it all. Actually, he already did. Come on. There are some projects that just seem to be horrible while you're doing them. It's a grind, it's a lot of work, you think I'm never gonna do this again, and then you get to the end and you can see the finished result and somehow it makes it all worth it. At the time I thought, I'm never trimming out a house again. Now that I see it, I might have one more in me. We are getting so close to having this cabin project completely wrapped up. We're almost ready to start moving in furniture. There's a few other little things that we need to do that we will be doing videos on, and we'll definitely do a grand reveal once it's all put together. But that's it for the trim. I know trim is not the most exciting video, but hopefully you learned something from this. Check out the links in the video description to our Patreon. Bourbon blade is in stock on the website, and there's a bunch of other stuff down there. Now I gotta go sit down, because I'm still tired.